Welcome back to The Explainer. Okay, let's just dive right into this. When we think about early America, we usually picture politics, treaties, and famous battles. But today we're setting the stage for a massive historical mystery, one that aligns perfectly with what you study in AP US history, but trust me, it goes a lot deeper and a whole lot darker than your standard textbook. We're going to look at how the real architects of this era were actually microscopic.
So, what was the absolute deadliest enemy in early America? If you're guessing the British Empire or maybe the harsh winters, you might want to think again. Before the very first battles for independence were ever fought with muskets, the fiercest, most terrifying wars for survival were being waged against devastating, unseen pathogens. To truly get a grip on the colonial era, we basically have to understand the germs that defined it.
Section 1. The Filthy English Origins.
To figure out how colonial America became this, hotbed for sickness, we actually have to rewind a bit and step back into 16th century England. Let's talk about the concept of enclosure. Between 1530 and 1630, England went through this strict legal process that restricted land access solely to wealthy owners. Before this, everyday peasants could use communal land to plant crops or graze their livestock. Then, suddenly, they were kicked off. We are talking about roughly half of the entire rural English peasant population being completely displaced. And this massive demographic shift directly fueled the push toward colonial settlement.
This whole enclosure situation created a perfect storm. Step 1, the peasants are displaced. Step 2, what do? They flock to the cities for relief, and urban populations just absolutely explode. London jumps from 120,000 people to 200,000 by the year 1600. And these cities lacked basic fresh water and proper sewage, making them incredibly filthy. So, step 3, Parliament comes up with this brilliant solution to the crisis. Make poverty a crime. Literally. If you were deemed a vagrant, you could be publicly whipped or even hanged if you stole. And finally, step 4, English officials decided the easiest way to clean up their disease-ridden cities was just to ship their poorest citizens off to the American colonies.
Section 2. The Transatlantic Incubator. For those desperate people seeking a fresh start, the journey over was an absolute nightmare. Whether we're talking about European immigrants hoping for prosperity or enslaved people violently forced onto ships from Africa, these vessels were basically floating petri dishes. You've got horribly cramped spaces, terrible hygiene with human waste everywhere, and contaminated drinking water. On top of that, the ships were crawling with lice, spiders, mice, and rats. It was the perfect breeding ground for diseases like dysentery, measles, and smallpox. In fact, the very first slave ship from the Dutch West India Company, which arrived in 1626, actually helped bring yellow fever to the New World.
And it gets even darker. In the foul-smelling holds of these ships, some dead bodies actually went completely unnoticed for long periods of time. Just a total horrific breakdown of sanitation. Because of this grim reality, arriving ships became the first clearly identifiable sources of disease, not just for the colonists already living on land, but tragically for the Native American populations as well.
Section 3, the colonial petri dish.
So, the settlers disembark into what we always picture as this pristine, untouched wilderness, right? Well, actually, they had zero infrastructure waiting for them, and honestly, zero knowledge of proper sanitation. Early colonial cities were unbelievably filthy. People literally discarded their human waste directly into the dirt streets. Without even realizing it, they had set up the perfect environment for sickness to just keep spreading right outside their front doors. And their big solution to this waste problem? It's pretty ironic. They relied on animals. Pigs, goats, and turkey buzzards basically roamed the streets, acting as a primitive waste management system. But obviously, those animals just added their own waste to the streets. Throw in all the horses used for daily transportation, and you've got towns that were essentially giant, unsanitary feeding grounds for disease.
Section 4. 4. Feared diseases.
All right, let's look at the heavy hitters. From the colonial era right through the American Revolution, people constantly suffered from outbreaks that attacked in two main ways. On one side, we have the mosquito-borne illnesses, malaria and yellow fever, which absolutely thrived in warmer climates and standing water. On the flip side, you had diseases spreading through human contact, smallpox and tuberculosis, which just tore through the densely packed, poorly ventilated homes of early colonial cities.
Let's start with smallpox, because it was easily the most feared at the time, causing horrific pustules and carrying a massive death rate of 30 to 50%.
But in the 1720s, this crazy process called variolation was introduced. Variolation meant taking pus from an infected person and inserting it directly into a small incision on a healthy person. Yeah, it has a major yuck factor, and it was super controversial because, oops, you could accidentally trigger an outbreak. But the medical results? Unbelievable. It slashed smallpox mortality from up to 50% down to just 1 to 5%.
This whole process of variolation literally changed history. Heavy hitters of the time like Reverend Cotton Mather and Benjamin Franklin strongly supported it. By the 1770s, it actually became a strategic military tool. Smallpox was a huge threat to the Continental Army, so General George Washington ordered his troops to be inoculated. It was a massive risk, but it paid off big time. Finally, in 1796, Edward Jenner discovered a much safer vaccination using cowpox, which led to the rapid decline of the disease.
Moving from smallpox to tuberculosis, or consumption as they called it back then, this one spread rapidly through close contact, slowly destroying the lungs over a period of years. Whole families would just be wiped out. But here is where it gets truly bizarre. By the 19th century, society actually romanticized this horrific disease. Because it caused weight loss and a really pale complexion, people thought it made dying women look beautifully pale. Talk about a really dark historical irony.
Down in the southern colonies, the Anopheles mosquito bred year-round, carrying malaria. Also known as quartal fever, it didn't always kill you immediately, but it caused recurring weakness and chills that just devastated the colonists' immune systems. But here is where disease directly intersects with macroeconomics in the most tragic way possible. Many enslaved Africans carried a genetic trait that actually made them resistant to malaria. Plantation owners noticed this, and this biological reality directly contributed to the horrific expansion and persistence of the African slave trade in the South.
And then there was yellow fever, the so-called stranger's disease, brought up from the West Indies. When it struck, the symptoms were brutal, vomiting black material, severe jaundice, killing victims in just days. The panic was absolute. During the 1793 Philadelphia epidemic, this disease wiped out an estimated 10% of the entire city's population in a single summer. It was so terrifying that President George Washington and the U.S. Congress literally packed up and fled the city, leaving the poor trapped near the waterfront to suffer and die.
Section 5. The Great Dying. Now, if you think the colonists had it bad, consider the communities with absolutely zero immunity to any of these imported pathogens. The devastation of Native American populations started incredibly early. As far back as 1587, an explorer named Thomas Harriot documented this really chilling pattern. Colonists would visit an Indian village, and within days of them leaving, the locals would rapidly fall ill and die. It was almost like a dark curse following the Europeans. Tribes like the Iroquois, the Huron, and the Cherokee suffered massive, rapid population losses simply from making contact.
And then came the absolute catastrophe, just before the Pilgrims arrived, in 1620. 75 to 95%. Let that sink in for a second. That is the estimated mortality rate of the Great Dying that struck the native populations of New England. Entire populations, including the Wampanoag and the Patuxent peoples, were virtually wiped out in a blink of historical time.
So when the Pilgrims finally landed, they didn't find a pristine wilderness. They found a graveyard. They stumbled upon fields and villages abandoned in a total hurry, crops and tools just left sitting there, and the skeletal remains of the people who once lived there scattered on the ground. Pilgrim Father Edward Winslow looked at the aftermath and wrote that it was, quote, not unlike the plague, if not the same.
But what exactly caused the Great Dying? Honestly, this remains one of history's great mysteries. Was it bubonic plague? Smallpox? Yellow fever? Modern historians and epidemiologists actually have a fascinating theory. They suggest it might have been leptospirosis. And how did it get there? It was spread by the rats on those incredibly filthy European ships we talked about at the very beginning of this explainer. The disease likely traveled from the ships to the Abenaki tribe, who then unknowingly spread it through trade routes to neighboring nations.
Which leaves us with this final, really provocative thought. We spend so much time memorizing dates and battles and the names of founding fathers. But if microscopic bugs determined whether a settlement survived, who was strong enough to win wars, and ultimately the tragic fate of entire native nations, how much of American history was actually dictated by an invisible antagonist? It really flips the script on everything you thought you knew about the colonial era, doesn't it? Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. Keep questioning the history you're handed, and I'll catch you next time.